If you don't know much about Total War or have been away from the franchise for years, the Dynasties update to Pharaoh may strike you as a very good improvement to the base game. More regions, more playable factions, the return of cavalry units, major improvements to battles, at least on paper, and if you've already bought the base game, you can grab all of this for free. I put several hours into the campaign playing as the Sea Peoples and several more hours in custom battles conducting combat tests. And for a few moments there, I lost myself in the game and was actually having fun. Here's where the issue comes in though, and I will preface this by saying that this dynamic is by no means unique to Pharaoh out of all the Total War games. The game's few strengths come attached with several qualifiers, almost like it's too embarrassed to commit to any coherent vision. On the one hand, morale actually matters now, but as I played the campaign on Legendary, that fact was relegated to the early game battles where I was using Sheridan Swordsmen, a medium infantry unit, to run over nonsense rabble that the AI was fielding. The moment I started encountering higher quality units like armored Anatolian spears, the difficulty bonuses granted to the AI became much more apparent. And before you say I could just turn down the difficulty to normal or to hard to tone down the difficulty modifiers, I don't agree with that based on the fact that not every Total War game has had to resort to such obnoxious bonuses in order to generate a challenge. Another issue that kneecaps battles is that lethality at its default setting hardly seems to have any bearing on the outcome of a fight. In my tests and campaign experience, I would notice a few more casualties on the charge, with effects dissipating after that. It's only when you set the lethality to 100% that battles finally come into their own, with charges regaining a sort of weight that they never really had since cavalry charges in Attila. Otherwise, cavalry charges are a familiar, sad affair where the unit slaps into the target and will probably lose the engagement despite favorable positioning. I remember a while back I showed a video of a Shogun 2 battle to a friend of mine who was into Rome 2 at the time, and who was shocked when they saw a unit of Yarikachi killing 30 or more men on a charge. Shogun 2 was the last game to use the hit point system that was in place since the very first Total War game. Rome 2 replaced that with health bars, which have been featured in every game since. So why does the combat feel so flaccid out of the box in Pharaoh? I'll let my past self explain. Every model in an infantry unit had a single hit point. When attacked in melee, a soldier would either dodge or parry the blow, or take the hit and die. Damage under the system was lethal, unlike the later games where men slowly chip away at each other's health bars. As in the example of a routing unit pushing through my men while barely taking any losses. Total War Pharaoh Dynasties is not so much a bad, dysfunctional game in the manner of Rome 2 as it is a confused mess. Like the developers overheard people talking about Shogun 2, Shogun 1, Medieval 1 and 2, but without playing those games extensively, they could only roughly replicate their strengths, while still saddled with all the awful legacy of Rome 2. Before I go further, for the people who are new to this channel and have taken issue with my harsh criticism of Pharaoh, I need to make it clear where the issues don't actually lie. It's not with the game's setting. The Bronze Age isn't my preferred era to read about. My bookshelves are occupied mostly by books on 19th and 20th century warfare, and you can guess that I take a particular interest in gunpowder warfare. But my favorite Total War games, Shogun 2, Fall of the Samurai, Napoleon, which were the first games that I sunk significant hours into in this franchise, they were very foreign games to me. I didn't have any background in those games' historical eras, not the Sengoku era, nor 19th century line warfare. Napoleon Total War is the game that introduced me to the famed generals campaigns. That was something Total War did, and did quite effortlessly. If you weren't already invested in the game's setting, the gameplay was strong enough to carry it. The idea that Pharaoh's detractors don't find the game appealing due to its setting is both a deflection and a rewriting of history. I am sure that plenty other Total War players were exposed to different eras in history through the games and not the other way around. The average Total War Pharaoh Dynasties fan strikes me as someone who read the Wikipedia entry on the Bronze Age collapse and now considers themselves an expert on the subject. To that I say, Total War has never been a historically faithful franchise, just historically inspired. The best Total War games were good for, among other reasons, their willingness to diverge from historical accuracy in favor of making a good game. Fall of the Samurai, for example, uses the Boshin War as an inspiration for its setting. But the real-life conflict was short and a relatively bloodless affair, not the vicious scrum involving devastating naval barrages tearing apart forts on a regular basis, and entire regions being sacked as seen in the game. Total War is at its best not when it shackles itself to the history it's trying to portray, but when it has a clear idea of what the game wants to be. Now for the elephant in the room, the expanded campaign map and faction count. I could devote considerable effort going through the different factions and how the game attempts to differentiate them, the different resources, how well the campaign handles its progression and simulates the Bronze Age collapse, and so on. But then I would be making the mistake that other YouTubers are. The campaign has never been the center of Total War and the game doesn't sell on it. Otherwise, the promotional material for Total War games, including Pharaoh, wouldn't feature the battles so prominently in their trailers and other videos. The narrative of Total War abandoning interesting battles in favor of a more immersive and interesting campaign experience was invented by the desperately coping fans trying to read The Tempest in a Teacup, because the developers apparently don't even follow that train of thought. Or they are cynically aware that the battles are a better marketing tool, since there is a long list of 4X games that have more in-depth strategic experiences than Total War, whether real-time or turn-based. Age of Empires does resource management better than Total War could ever hope to. For turn-based games, Civilization handily beats Total War in faction count and your ability to tailor your faction's progression to your own vision. Why anyone would insist that Total War abandon the one thing that few other big budget games have tried, large-scale, real-time battles where positioning wins you the day, is beyond me. That's why the expanded campaign map fails to excite me in any way. They keep on dumping all this effort into something akin to an evolutionary dead end. Do we really need all these extensive campaign customizations? Are we really expected to do this much pre-playing before we get to the actual game? This is the culmination of trying to make a game that is all things to all players. What about the building and research trees? My opinions on those have not changed since my last critique of Pharaoh. Another problem is not unique to Outposts, but extends to the rest of the building and tech tree. The overwhelming focus on stat modifiers, many of them passive. The technology tree is particularly riddled with incremental stat buffs, which is not only difficult to parse, but also not very interesting to engage with. I've said it before and it bears repeating. Fall of the Samurai brought us the best building trees and tech progression the series has seen. Almost every military tech was unlocking a building and some units. Revolver cavalry tech unlocked the unit of the same name. Explosive shells unlocked explosive shells for warships, arms deals unlocked skirmishers, and so on. There were some passive stat buffs among these military technologies, but they were usually secondary to the unlocked buildings and units. On the economic side, technologies did provide several stat bonuses, but these were all quite substantial rather than small incremental improvements. When it comes to the buildings, almost every building line gave you access to a unit or agent. Cadet schools, for example, are incredibly potent as they not only give you access to line infantry, but also spawn a single unit of expendable line infantry during siege defenses, greatly improving the area's defensiveness. In order for a building or tech tree to not feel like bureaucratic busywork, it needs to have clear, decisive effects on the game world. A bunch of techs that give plus 5% or plus 10% to stone generation, or wood generation, or more XP gained per battle just do not hit in the same way. Rather than unlocking strategic and tactical options, each with their own opportunity costs, you're simply amassing more power for yourself. To put it another way, as far as Total War campaigns go, Simpler has always been better. The system where you had one resource, money, which you gained through pillaging, economic buildings, and trade, and spent on recruiting and maintaining armies, was straightforward and, most importantly, it worked. It was partly let down by questionable unit balancing, particularly in the case of Yashigaru, who were far too effective for their cost, which in turn meant most military buildings were a hard sell. That was a problem with unit balancing and not the building system itself, though. The other major addition, Mortal Leaders and Family Trees, are a sad reintroduction of something that was standard fare in older games. Only the fact that you can't have armies without generals once again devalues the idea of keeping family members safe. And yes, even with all the changes this update has made, they still can't shake off the terrible ideas running back to Rome 2. Forcing generals on armies is back again and restricts how freely you can operate. Bolstering a garrison with a few units or sending one cheap unit off to scout, which would be very important with a map this large, that all continues to be impossible. In conclusion, Pharaoh has a vague idea of what it wants to be, but the developers either lack the technical expertise or the willingness to commit to it. They have made the same mistake of Rome 2 yet again, focusing the majority of their efforts into an aspect of the game, the campaign, that was and will never be the series' strength, all while once again failing to free themselves from that game's awful design decisions. I also don't share the optimism that the positive changes to battles are a sign that the developers are taking Total War back in the right direction, because they have had a habit of not carrying over changes to the next game. After all, Pharaoh's lethality is a reintroduction of the critical hits from Thrones of Britannia, and that system was not carried over into Warhammer or Three Kingdoms. In case it isn't obvious, if you don't already own Pharaoh, then I simply don't recommend getting it for Dynasties. While Dynasties is an objective improvement over the base game, it doesn't attempt anything substantial that previous games haven't already done. If you're interested in ancient warfare specifically or pre-modern warfare generally, then any of the pre-Empire Total War games will serve you better. And if you just want the best real-time tactics experience that Total War has to offer, then Fall of the Samurai is excellent value and you're better off with it.